All right.
I just here for the show. So I'm gonna let you take it over.
Oh, already. All right. So I don't have slides. I just have me talking. I could sit. I could stand. Are you okay if I sit? You know, and but let me do that since that's a little bit easier. I like to actually record. So one of the things is I don't have enough of myself on social media. So that's one of the things that I'm trying to do is collect more talks so that it's not just of use here, but really beyond here. So I'm Michael Luongo. I'm a Purdue HTM student in hospitality and tourism management. My PhD looks at tourism redevelopment in the context of conflict. Also a journalist. I've been a journalist, do I want to say, since before you were all born. And I really want to thank Dr. Hall for inviting me here. It's really great to speak here to all of you. And I also teach COM 114. And originally my PhD was designed to be both HTM and communication kind of together, working under Dr. Knaughton. And COVID happened, I delayed for a year, and a lot of stuff kind of changed from there. So, you know, I've taken a look at the syllabus for here. I think you have to do something based on those of us who are guest speakers. Is that true? So that's interesting. So more about myself. I mean, I've written for the New York Times, a lot of LGBT publications, a lot of travel publications. I was Journalist of the Year for the North American Travel Journalists Association. Really, they used to use the term Grand Prize in Travel Journalism, and also NLGGA, the National Lesbian and Gay Journalists Association. And in my travels, I've been to 100 countries in all 7 continents, so I've been to quite a few places. So I'm really here mostly to talk with you about interviewing, and if you need to interject anything, Dr. Hall, or have questions or guide anything, you know, let me know. I have a series of notes and things that I want to talk about, but you know, feel free to break in at certain points, and hopefully I'll have enough time for Q&A. One of the things that I'm going to ask you is that, you know, when you begin an interview, it's always good to ask, how much time are you giving me as part of the interview? Do I have the whole class, or do I have just a portion of the class? What? Whole class. Okay, perfect. All right. So for me, when I think about interviews and when I think about the whole concept in a very broad way, I kind of think that there's 2 parts to the process of interviews. One is the actual skill of the interview. So getting information from people, doing the research ahead of time, making people as comfortable as possible, knowing how to dig deeper in the course of that time with that person or that group of people. I've seen you have to do a variety of different kinds of interviews for interesting and unique answers. The other part of it that I think is really important is the process of networking and being a journalist or a researcher who puts yourself into situations where you can meet people who will be interesting people to interview, or who will be very important contacts for you down the road. How many of you are taking this class because you intend to be journalists, to use it for researching? Are most of you communication majors, or what? Tell me kind of your own background so I can try to answer some things or speak in a certain way. Go ahead.
Most of us are just saying this class is a requirement for graduation.
Okay.
I'm a financial planning major.
Okay.
I don't think we actually have any common majors.
Okay.
So this class, it's pretty diverse. We have from HTM, we have some sales
Really?
and selling.
Okay.
And then we have a lot of computer, cyber security.
Okay.
So, but one of the things I've been stressing in class is, even if you're, say, not a journalist, being able to ask good questions is such a fundamental
Yeah.
as a
Yeah.
leader,
Yeah.
manager, so.
Yeah, and I think it's what we do with COM 114 is, you know, people aren't necessarily going to be giving TEDx talks or speaking to Congress, but it's also this idea that in your everyday job, whether it's your career here at Purdue or your job afterwards, you're going to need to do public speaking in one form or another. So I think the idea of being able to interview no matter what you do is great. I will say I was an undergrad in communications at Rutgers University. I also did UCLA Summer Film School while I was an undergrad. And then I went back for a master's in urban planning at Rutgers. But when I was an undergrad, it's really interesting contrasting, and that was a long time ago, it was the late 80s. I think most of anybody who took communication was really generally in communication at Rutgers. And I'm not sure how much that has shifted, or is our department unique in how many people who are non-communication take communication?
Well, I think because we fulfill the oral comm credit, most students get exposure to us from 114 or 217. And then we just end up on these plans of studies because I think other departments recognize the value.
Okay,
So,
perfect.
yeah.
So that helps me to kind of think about this also. The other thing that I would point out in an interview is this idea of small talk. So we're having that kind of conversation a little bit about you, right? Before we're actually beginning the main program. So one of the things, depending on if you have a lot of time or enough time, is to begin a little bit of small talk to get to know the person you are interviewing. The other part of that, especially depending on how difficult the interview will be, is you want to ask the quote-unquote softball or easier questions first. And by that, I don't necessarily mean like, oh, where are you from? Where'd you, like all the stuff you should already know based on your research. That can inform your questions, but as you get to know the person, and that's when you're going to ask the more difficult questions. And I'll kind of give some examples for myself of more difficult questions as I go through. So again, we've talked about timing. A lot of you will probably use cell phones for when you record interviews. I use one of these. It's an actual professional recorder. Converts things into, and then I just download things. It's much more dense than what you would record on your phone usually. Sometimes as a backup, I'll have both. But these are sort of our tools of the trade. You can actually have a larger one, but this is the one that I usually use and that I carry. So these are things to also think about when you are doing interviews. The other part of this, so you want to record with permission. You want to hopefully have that permission. It's sort of a catch-22, have that permission recorded so that the person later doesn't say you recorded me without my knowledge. So you want to ask if you can record, have them state on the recording, yes, I give my permission to record. And so that's one thing, but I will say that when you have a recorder, and again, the comfort of the person you are interviewing is paramount to getting as much information out of them. If I'm sitting at a table with you and I'm trying to get some information that might be sensitive, you might stare at that the whole time that I'm sitting at a table with you, right? Particularly if I'm going to ask you something more sensitive. So you may want to have it with other clutter. You may want to have the phone out. The other thing to do, and I didn't bring a notebook with me, is to use this in conjunction with a paper notebook. And part of it is because even though you're recording, you want to take notes at certain points. The other thing is that the person then also thinks not about the recording, but begins to think about how you are taking notes on paper and becomes more comfortable with that. I do think that for many of you young people, you don't necessarily think in paper terms, but I think that it can add a lot of comfort doing that. The other thing that I think is important, and I'm kind of going to skip around in my own notes, is when you are asking people questions, and at a certain point, we'll talk a little bit more about closing out an interview, you can close that notebook, and then the person breathes a sort of sigh of relief. You're still recording. You haven't said to them you've actually ended the interview, but there's a certain psychological thing where you've closed the notebook, and this gets somebody to kind of talk about the more comfortable, funny anecdotes. And then you can always still do notes, or you have the recording, but there's ways in which to use your devices which normally would make somebody a little bit paranoid or a little bit worried, but you can use them to increase comfort levels. And so that's one of the important things about using both the notebook and an actual recorder. Does any of this sound familiar or make sense to you as you're going through? So that's one of the things that I often think about. Again, we've talked about research, knowing as much as possible about the person you were interviewing. There's really nothing worse, even as somebody who's been interviewed, where you go in and the person clearly has not done any research. hasn't read your book, hasn't seen what you've done, isn't familiar with your bio. So I think one of the things is to ask people, can you give me a standard bio that you usually use if you have time before this? Is there a website or is there something that you recommend that I look at before I interview you? Or again, sometimes people, and I think this is one of the problems in interviewing academics, is that academics will send you 10 of their academic papers for you to look at before speaking to them, and you don't have time for that. So you may want to figure out a summary. I think to talk about AI now actually is helpful for summarizing some of the material that you might get now, and I think that's a proper use of AI in that case. You're not doing your writing with AI, but you're using it to summarize documents that you might get. At least read the Amazon review of the book of that person, see what they have on YouTube, look at their social media. There may be something quirky that you weren't aware of before the interview. There may also be some connection, like maybe the person's from your hometown, or maybe your parents went to the same school, or some way that you can also get to know them better before the interview beyond the subjects that you have there. I did want to talk with you a little bit, also having your notes on paper, and you may want to make notations on the paper. So again, I'm one of those older people, so I'm very paper person. This is how I make my notes, whether I'm giving a speech or other things, bold, highlight, so that I can just glance at a moment at some of the things. But this, I think, is a little bit easier than trying to fumble through your phone or through a tablet to, what was that question that I wanted to ask? Also, in the course of a conversation with somebody, you may go off on tangents the way that you normally do with any kind of conversation. And then having your notes makes it easier for you to check off, or at the end of the interview to say, oh, let me make sure that I asked all the important questions. Also, if you were expecting a 45-minute interview, but something happens and they said, well, we only have 10 minutes, you can quickly glance here and see what your most important questions were, all right? So that's why I think paper notes, when you have the time and you are able to prepare, are really important to have. And again, for scribbling things, closing out the interview, I guess I want to also talk more about reining people in also. So you want to close out the interview, maybe a statement like, I really appreciate this, closing the notebook, but continuing to ask questions. So that's one of the things that I've talked with you about. You also, I'm going to actually talk about specific people that I've interviewed because I think that would be useful. So actually most young people don't know who Sophia Loren is, and I'm not really a celebrity interviewer, but I've interviewed Sophia Loren for the New York Times. Anybody know who she is? Usually you know Sofia Vergara, but not necessarily Sophia Loren, but a really, really important Italian actress. And for her 80th, what was then her 80th birthday, she had a new book that was out. I was able to interview her because a friend of mine actually, she's somebody who's very difficult to interview, but a friend of mine actually had my eyeglass, coincidentally my eyeglass tie on, he was the person who was part of the Sophia Loren eyeglass company, which kind of older ladies now probably are, who wears these. So anyway, I was able to interview her. I was supposed to have 20 minutes, she gave me 45 minutes. So it was actually quite gracious, and in fact, it's on the phone to Switzerland. I did meet her in person later. So she was quite gracious. The other thing that she did is, she's an actress, and she's emotional, and in talking about her husband, her late husband, Carlo Ponti, she began to cry at the end, and whether this is acting or whether I actually had questions that kind of got this out of her. She also knew that I was nervous interviewing her, so she made me comfortable. This is a mega star to be interviewing. So that was also very interesting. But the thing is, at the end, when I had written this up for the Times, and it was about hotels that she stayed in, this was back in 2015, but again related to her book. The best part was there at the end, where she felt that the interview was mostly over. And this is when she began to cry and be very emotional. Remember, she's an Italian actress, so she's emotional anyway. And I say that as an Italian American. And writing it up, because this was at the end, my editor cut this part off where she's crying at the end. And to me, this is the best part of the interview. And so I had to fight to keep what I felt was the best part of the interview in. Her crying at the end of an interview. Now, I'm not a celebrity interviewer, but this is a feather in my cap, I suppose I would like to say, in terms of interviews. But this is an idea of getting the best out of a person. She's kind of has this view that the interview has closed. She gets very emotional. She gives me more time. She's made me comfortable, but she's also enjoying the interview. This is another thing that I think is really key, depending on how you are interviewing people, is it can be very cathartic for the person to tell their story, particularly something that's more difficult or more emotional. Are you familiar with that word cathartic? And the sort of release that it comes from. Also, people can be very flattered to be able to tell their story. So this is another thing that's really important to think about in the course of an interview. This also may mean, and this is where your notes are really important, is that you need to rein people in at times. Like the interview may be, for my research here on tourism redevelopment in the context of conflict, it became like talking to your old uncle about his travel stories, and he's not concentrating on Iraq, which is what I was interviewing about, and he's talking about all the different places that he's gone to, and what should have been a 45-minute interview became 2 hours, and now I've got to comb through all of that to look for the salient points. And so it can be this balance of making the person comfortable, making sure that you're getting what they want out of them, making sure that they don't feel too coerced, but sometimes you really have to rein people in. If you've ever moderated a panel, or if you're doing I think you also have to do focus groups, which can be very difficult to rein in people, particularly if one person wants to speak a little bit more than others. So that I think is really important. The other thing is to talk about difficult questions. And I don't know how much you've gone into where people are afraid to be on the record, they're talking about something controversial. I think now, things that used to not be controversial are now very controversial in a very divided environment. But I will tell you specific articles that I've written that were very difficult to get people on the record for. One was about weddings on plantations for the New York Times. That article actually took 5 years to appear in print because it was such a difficult article to put together. My editors were very afraid of it. It was a controversial article to begin with, this idea of having weddings at places which were for slavery. And getting both, it was also about race, white issues, black issues, getting people to talk about these issues, where this fit in with history, where this fit in with business, what do we do going forward, what is the experience of a white woman choosing a plantation for her wedding, what is the experience of a black woman. In fact, black women do sometimes choose a plantation if it has something to do with their history. But it was a very controversial article. And in many ways, what you have to do is speak to people a lot beforehand before they commit to being on the record. Is anybody familiar with the movie She Said? This is about Harvey Weinstein. Are you folks familiar with Harvey Weinstein? And so this is a movie about Jodie Cantor and, I have it in my notes, I'm going to blank on her last name, Tu Hui, can't remember now her first name. But it's the women who put together the article looking at Harvey Weinstein, and this became a movie. And this movie is great at explaining how difficult it was to get these women on the record about what Harvey Weinstein did to them. And that is a great example of working with people for the truth and helping them to not be afraid to tell the truth. I've also done a lot on the killings of gay men in Baghdad, for example, and doing that in Baghdad, and getting people both on the record, but not so much on the record because we have to protect their identities, and sometimes you have to do that in the course of an interview. Getting them to ultimately tell the truth for a variety of reasons. One, culturally, it's very difficult to tell someone that you're actually gay. and you may have also experienced trauma. It's a war zone. So this idea of figuring out how to also read between the lines, and ultimately, after a very long conversation, get somebody to speak about what you need, while also protecting their identity. Go ahead, you had a question?
Yeah, I just want to like follow up. I read a little bit of your bio. And I was curious, what made you want to start writing about? I feel like you bring a unique perspective to journalism, especially in war zones, like, especially writing for like LGBTQ questions. And why inspired you to do that instead of like what typical journalism looks like in a war
So
zone?
my journalism career is a little bit different maybe from other people's, but I think everybody has a variety of different ways that they go into journalism. I had, as an academic, I was among the first to research gay travel. This was when I was the idea of queer studies didn't really exist in the early 90s, but I had done a lot academically on gay travel, and then wrote gay travel articles. And I will say what vastly transformed my journalism, and also ultimately is why I'm here at Purdue, was 9/11 and Ground Zero. So my then brother-in-law was a cop. This is all in the TEDx that I gave here 2 years ago. My then brother-in-law was a cop. I went into Ground Zero with him a few days after, and this idea of digging for dead bodies in the rubble of Ground Zero was very transforming, to say the least. But also I knew, so I've done war reporting, but I'm not necessarily a frontline war reporter. And so what I did at that experience was I knew we were going to be invading a lot of countries, Afghanistan in particular, and then later we invaded Iraq. What could I do as a journalist who covered both LGBT issues and travel issues, but in conflict zones? And so I went into war zones from that perspective, knowing what my particular skills were. And so I'm not necessarily doing the battleground frontline coverage, but I'm finding particular ways where my skills fit into conflict zones. And I think that you're all young, and one of the things to think about is you may pick something when you graduate, or you may not graduate into a job that's perfect for you, and also don't worry about picking something and then changing careers over time. And your unique skills and unusual skills, perhaps, may be very helpful for whatever you do in the future. So hopefully that answers that question to some degree. But it was the circumstances of being in New York at that time. Most people run away from disaster, but journalists tend to run into disaster. And so that's an example of figuring out a way to get into Ground Zero, and it was with my then brother-in-law.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
And my follow-up is just, if somebody wants to especially go into those war zones, especially with many conflicts that are happening right now, what advice do you have? Maybe to stay safe, or make sure you're
So
the right person.
That's quite a long, we could talk a little bit more about that in detail after.
Okay.
And I'm Michael, your name is?
Kenny.
There are ways to mitigate risk. Knowing other journalists, it can be more risky as a freelance journalist, particularly depending on the publications you're working for. I'm supposed to be in Ukraine in May as part of my research, but there's ways we can talk in more detail on that too, or maybe in the Q&A, depending. We can also get into more of that. The other movie that I wanted to mention, and people sometimes think I look like him, is Mark Ruffalo, and I've met him, is the Boston Spotlight about the abuse by priests of children. So that's another movie that's a really good journalism movie to look at how. Are you folks familiar with that movie? You know who Mark Ruffalo is, though, I think, right? So it's interesting because he was always in independent films, and then he was in, I guess he was in a Marvel, wasn't he in a Marvel or the Hulk or something? And little kids then knew like who he was because of, and would point at me like, Mark Ruffalo. Anyway, when my hair was shorter, I looked a little bit more like him. So those are things that I think are really important, is to think about, getting some of those difficult questions and getting things from people. And again, the difficult question should come later if there's time after you've made that person comfortable. So kind of talked about probing. This is another thing I want to talk with you folks about, is encouraging people to go deeper. And easier said than done. So, you ask a question, and then you should have some sub-questions when you think about it, about going deeper into that. But there's ways in which you can do that conversationally that seem to be easier transitions. So you can say, it's interesting that you say this, I wanted to know more. And you can make a note to go back to something for one. You can also say, that's interesting. Can you tell me more about that? Or what did people think about that? Or how did people react to that? I'm glad you mentioned that. Can you say more? The other thing to do, and again, it depends on how much anonymity another person needs, is if you have been interviewing a variety of people on a subject. So let's suppose you folks are going to do market research with your interviews. I was interviewing somebody and they said this about the product. Can you tell me what you think about this? Of course, if you watch the She Said movie, they do this a lot because they're interviewing people anonymously. But this idea of contrasting this answer from someone with information that you already have ahead of time without giving away who that person is. Though sometimes you can give away who that person is if there's a group of people who know each other. This is used in interrogation, like on Law and Order, for example, things like that. But you can also use it for marketing. You can use it for journalism. You can use it in a variety of ways. Some of the things that I always say when you are closing out an interview, also to get more information, is there anything that I didn't ask that you wanted to tell me that didn't come up as a conversation or as a question? Or generally when you interview celebrities, is there something you've always wanted to tell a journalist that you haven't told a journalist? So something like that. And also, is there anyone else I should speak with? This can create bias because they're going to put you in touch with people who have their similar opinions, but not always. And this is a good way to use your sources to get more sources. The other thing that I recommend to people is always get email and phone. Because you can get an email, but you can ignore an email, but you can't necessarily ignore a phone call, all right? So that's another thing that's really important. Ordinary citizens, and again, this is more journalistic, they have to be aware, one of the issues in interviewing ordinary people is they may not know the impact of what that article will do to them. As an example, and the person was very upset, with this is again a New York Times article that I had done. It was on, a phrase for it, there's many different ways to phrase this, accent reduction. So again, it was about speech, and it was about when you are giving a public speech, if you're an immigrant, if you are, say you want to reduce some of your regional accents within the United States, for example, and it's about training, voice training, so that when you engage in public speaking, you have a flatter way of speaking. This particular person who was the client of one of the people that I interviewed, those particular articles, we interview the one person and then we interview their client and kind of go back and forth. He was very upset that he felt that to be quite frank, he felt stupid from that article. Now, explained to him, well, it's the New York Times, a lot of people read, you've all heard of the New York Times. The intention was not for him to feel that way, but it was about, he was explaining that he had an accent when he spoke, but somehow when it finally arrived, he didn't realize how many people would read that article. So if you think that somebody might be more sensitive about something, and they're an ordinary person who could be hurt by what you write or do, make sure that they very clearly understand the issue, all right? So that I think is important. Again, reining people in. Some interviews that I think you should really look at to get the idea of a flow. Those transcribed interviews, like Ezra Klein for the New York Times, he'll often have the podcast transcribed. How many of you listen to podcasts regularly? Right? So these are great ways also to get an idea of the rhythm and flow of a conversation and how it happens. The other thing to remember is people have agendas and they have scripts. I think you've often heard of talking points that people have, particularly politically. I interviewed Billy Porter from Pose. Actually, I've interviewed almost everyone in Pose, and I've actually never seen the show. And in the interview, he had this seemed like a very beautiful quote. And then I realized that when he got on stage at the same event, he said word for word what he just told me. And then when I looked up this quote, he says this quote again and again and again. And so you also have to realize is try to figure out ways when something sounds a little rote or rehearsed, how do you get them to phrase that differently? And so we did, ultimately I shortened what I was gonna write about from him, but that's an example of where people are so used to being interviewed that they say the same thing again and again and again. And very often that happens with celebrities and politicians. So you've got to figure out a way to get something a little bit more interesting from them. Sometimes this can become hostile. I don't know if you've kind of talked about hostile interviews. So as a very pointed example from a conflict zone, and again looking at travel in the context of conflict, across from the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, there was a plan to build, I think it was a Hyatt, I can't remember the hotel. The rumor around Kabul was that, and as a journalist, when you hear rumors, you're going to ask people about the rumors that you're hearing, just to see what is going on. And it wasn't a rumor that was not sensible. If they built the hotel across from the U.S. Embassy, they were going to build a tunnel underneath for emergencies, so that if something happened to the embassy, the people from the embassy could flee underneath the hotel, and vice versa from the hotel, they could flee underneath the U.S. Embassy. That, to me, is a pretty innocuous and a logical thing. When I asked that at the U.S. Embassy, they became very hostile. I don't have a recording of that because they didn't allow you to do recording, but they did a recording of me so that if I reported something that they didn't want to answer, they could then have the recording against me. But it was very interesting that, to me, a very logical question was somehow hostile, according to the U.S. Embassy. But it's very logical that the U.S. would have an escape route. Now, whether that's asking them about government secrets, and that's why they became hostile, but it's a very logical question for you to ask as a journalist. Now, there may be questions that you ask that are somewhat difficult. So Raul Castro's daughter, Mariela Castro, Cuba, so she's the niece of Fidel. When I was in Cuba in 2003, covering LGBT issues, the rumor around town was that her father was gay. And so I'm just repeating what many gay Cubans would tell me about Raul Castro. When I finally met Mariela Castro, who does not do interviews, I was like, I'm meeting her at an event, and I'm not gonna not ask her about this. So she was very gracious, and also I'm doing this in Spanish, I'm not doing this in English. So it's a little bit more of a different level of issue. So she was very gracious. She said, well, because I work in LGBT issues, everybody thinks I'm a lesbian or a transgender or a drag queen. So she answered it with a bit of humor. But if I had not asked that question, which could be interpreted as hostile, I would never have gotten this kind of answer from her. So don't be afraid also to ask questions. But, being asked a rumor about your father being gay could be interpreted as a hostile question. But always ask those unusual questions. This is where I'm going to actually get to you about networking and going to events and how important this is. So as a journalist, and I hope actually that he pulls through everything. I lived in Buenos Aires, I used to write guidebooks, I know the Pope. So, I knew the Pope before he was Pope. And I didn't like the Pope because he was very anti-gay, very anti-women when he was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires. But he's among the most important people out of Argentina. So I would go to the holiday events, I would speak to him. I may have even had his phone number in my, when you wake up one day, the Pope, which is quite fascinating. The Clinton Summit, so Bill Clinton, around UN Week, which is also called, the UN calls it something different, the General it's not the General Convention. What's UN? Everyone in New York calls it UN Week, but the UN calls it something else. So in September, when the General Assembly, the Clinton Summit, there's all these other events that happen. And when you go to those, you can meet world leaders. So the Clintons used to have an event, which they revived, I think, the Clinton Summit. So I met Bill, I met Hillary, I met Chelsea. Chelsea was like, I don't talk to journalists, and you shouldn't be anywhere near me. It was really a strange interaction with Chelsea. But Bill, when I met him, I can't say that I actually interviewed him, but his people said you have to wait to talk to him. And this is also where at events, looking at all the things that are going on at the event is fascinating. He shook hands with every single person at that hotel before he would speak with me. And from the person who ran the event to the person sweeping the floor. And this, I think, is fascinating information. So when you're at events relating to people, you should also see what's going on to add color, and also ask questions that you might not have because you were in that environment with that person. I met, before she was president, Christina Kirchner, who was technically the second female president of Argentina. And I went to this event knowing, again, it was during UN Week, she's going to be president of Argentina. And I'm going to talk to her now and find out who her press contact is and ask her about interviewing her before 100 other American journalists are going to do it. Now, ultimately in Buenos Aires, she doesn't do interviews, though I've done off-the-record talks with her. And so these are also important networking things. I have met Trump. I don't know if we've had this conversation. So I'll tell this in a humorous way. So again, this was at Trump Tower. This was before he was president, and this is the importance of going to events. Originally, I don't cover golf and I don't cover the Caribbean. I was invited to an event at Trump Tower. This was back in 2006. I think that was also the same year I met the Clintons, and 2006, 2007 for them. And a friend said, well, if we go to this event, we get to see what Trump's hair actually looks like, for real. So, and I said, well, that's a good enough reason to go. So his hair looked better, at least back then, in person than it did on TV. I don't know about now. But that's and then there's more anecdotes from that, but I won't get into that. But these are things that can add color. These are things, and there's often people at events. So at the Clinton Summit, you meet David Axelrod, at that time Madeleine Albright, a lot of really important, a lot of the CEOs. In a way now you won't have access to CEOs in the way that you used to. How many people here went to the Sam Feist talk, the CEO of C-SPAN? And the communication school is very connected to C-SPAN. So he was in town. And that's the thing, is one of the advantages that you have as a young person on a college campus is you have this ability to meet very important people. And what I also recommend is you may not know if you need to talk to that person, but going to an event, introducing yourself, and then maybe 2 years from now, and this is part of, we used to call this the Rolodex, if you have ever seen a Rolodex, but basically your database. I don't know who to talk to, but wait a minute, I met 2 years ago so-and-so, let me see if I still have that person's contact. And this is how, as a journalist, as a researcher, even if you're doing market research, this is how you begin to develop a Rolodex, a database of people. You also want to, if you have met people, interviewed them, sometimes this is done through public relations, particularly with celebrities. Michael Severus, who's a Broadway star, and he played Juan Perón, and again, I write a lot on Argentina. I have his email, so when I need to write something that's related to the Peróns or related to Argentina, even though he plays so many other things, he also has a band, I can send him an email and say, look, I need a quote related to this, and then we'll figure out a time. Richard Blanco, who was the inaugural poet under Obama? It's under Obama, openly gay, also Cuban American. His press person had reached out to me to interview him. I did a New York Times article and a Gay City News article. He gave me his information, and he said, you know, we originally set this up via a press person, but if you ever need to quote me, it's just easier for you to just call me or send me an email. And so if you can kind of do that, one of the issues with celebrities is they are so hard to reach out to. I'm from Bruce Springsteen's high school. And do you young people know who Bruce Springsteen is? Okay, good. And I very often get assignments from editors to interview Bruce Springsteen because I'm a journalist who went to his high school. However, I don't have a way of reaching him directly. And every time I try to do this through his press people, they say, oh, we asked him and he said he doesn't want to be interviewed by you. And I can guarantee that I bet that his press people never asked him. So that was a New York Times thing, a Wall Street Journal thing, some LGBT things. And I guarantee that they just never asked him. And so my last name, Luongo, if anybody here follows hockey. So I am related to Roberto Luongo, you're nodding your head. I have wanted to interview him. And I've explained to his press people that, you know, I'm not just a crazy person with the same last name. I'm a real working journalist, and explain. So our families are from the same little village in Italy, and I found that out by going to that little. But I bet you his press people, they don't ask him, you know. So it can be very hard once you have interviewed someone or trying to reach out to people. It can be very difficult. What is interesting now in the age of social media is how do some people now reach out to celebrities? Social media, you DM them. And sometimes they respond. So that can be a very interesting thing to do. So I will say that being a journalist, being a researcher, these are really special things. You get to see things behind the scenes. You get to do things that quote unquote ordinary people don't get to do. You get to know people. You have a front row view of history is also another way to put it. But I also think it's important to be polite, to be persistent. When you've interviewed someone, send them a link to that article so they know that that article is out. Give them permission. It helps you as well. They can put that on their social media. They can send that out to their friends. But follow up with people. And sometimes when you write something, they can't always appear. I've interviewed people and they've given me great interviews, but it gets cut out of the final piece, for example. So those are things that I would say. And always ask that anything else, you know, and can I be in touch with you again in the future? These kinds of ways of keeping in touch with people, even if they are hostile people or seem hostile. You know, I still work with press attachés in embassies all the time. So that's really all that I have to say. We only have about 5 minutes. Did you folks have any questions for me? Go ahead.
So, on the topic of your research and sort of the time and place on how you conduct these interviews, when you're looking at how to redevelop tourism in areas affected by conflict, how do you balance your journalistic goals with like the sensitive period following an active war?
So
might not be top of mind for a lot of the civilians.
So this is, well, here at Purdue we have a thing called the IRB, the Institutional Review Board. And this is actually a very tricky thing with my research. So the IRB has told me that my interviews related to people in war zones cannot be conducted while either I or they are in the war zone. So they must be conducted while they're out of the war zone. I'm going to Ukraine. This I will probably have to treat purely journalistically, but it will still inform my research. And being in a war zone does leave people vulnerable, which is part of what you're getting at. But researching and doing the work as an academic researcher and as a journalist are two different things, but they're related. And you have to really, I could have my PhD, this has happened to people, they haven't followed the IRB correctly, and they are doing human subjects research. And then they just get thrown out, their PhD just gets invalidated. So for me in particular, and I'm hoping to do a fellowship in Rwanda, but Rwanda is not an active war zone anymore. This is looking at something 30 years. IRB may take a different view, but since IRB has largely looked at my Iraq work and my pending Ukraine work. This is, anything for the PhD has to be, I can't interview that person in the conflict zone. And I may update the IRB. The journalistic work, if I do that and then publish it, then I can refer to myself, but that's separate from, it's a tricky thing. Hopefully that kind of answers your question. But you really have to protect, someone I interviewed in Egypt did have to flee Egypt. And I have interviewed people who, I photographed. This is really separate from my journalism. This is a terrible thing to talk about. This is in Iraq where like little girls who were part of a ballet class, they were massacred. And some of those girls I photographed for an event in were we in Baghdad for that? We were in Erbil, we were in Kurdistan for that. So people that I have, and these were just little girls who took like ballet classes. So this unfortunately happens when you are in conflict zones. So
Are you saying that's related to like you?
it's not related to me photographing them, but
Part of the.
it's part of what unfortunately happens in a conflict zone. Go ahead.
Is knowing like a native language important to
Oh.
journalism in other countries?
So I speak Spanish. I test as fluent. I think I speak like a child when I speak it. I do know French, a little bit of a lot of languages. I think that knowing a little bit of a lot of languages is really very helpful. I did study Arabic, but it's a really difficult. I also knew Hebrew before Arabic, and so I speak Arabic with a Hebrew accent, which is quite dangerous actually, because then you come off like an Israeli spy. So I actually try not to, and the languages are so similar, I mix them up, which is very different from mixing up my Italian and my Spanish. So knowing a little bit of a lot of languages is very helpful and will make somebody more comfortable, and they'll know that you went and did that effort. And so that I think is really important. But knowing another language, whether you're American born or you came as a child or you're an immigrant, the ability to speak multiple languages is really useful for going back and doing reporting, for example. But yeah, any skill you have is doubled when you speak more than one language, and that's beyond just interviewing. So, any other questions? And I'll stay for like a minute or two afterwards, and then also give you my contact, which is just M. Luongo. Actually, I'm the only Luongo in all of Purdue, so you could, as far as I know, and so you could just look up Luongo. But that's kind of it. Yeah. Any other questions? Or Dr. Hall, did you want to close
No,
on
I just
anything?
want to thank you. I didn't even know half these people that you interviewed. So, what an interesting, all right.
It does
thank
make
you.
life interesting, but I'm very poor. I don't have a lot of money, but I'm rich in experiences. So thank you all.
Okay, guys, I will see you on Monday.